everyone. Welcome to the Powerhouse podcast, where we bring to you the powerhouses of the mitochondrial world. I'm your host, Brian Harmon, President and CEO of the United Mitochondrial Disease Foundation, and joined, as always, by my trusty co-host, my partner in podcasting, Dr. Phil Yeski. Phil, do we have any other titles that I missed for you this morning?
I appreciate you keeping the word crime out of that.
I debated as I was prepping for the show. I was like, I need to come up with some fun new nicknames for Dr. Yeski, but a dutiful soldier for UMDF, and so much going on right now. It's keeping you very busy, Phil. And we wanted to start off this show a little bit just giving some updates on what we've been affectionately calling the research ecosystem at UMDF. And so much of, I think, what our community knows is our ability to find and fund the best research around the globe. But oftentimes we don't share enough about what it takes just to build the home to do that. And you've been part of some really exciting projects over the past couple of years on this. And one that comes to mind right out of the gate for me is some of the success we're having around genetic testing.
Sure. Yeah, no, really excited that we were able to dive in on sort of this first phase of a diagnostic initiative, recognizing that if we don't have diagnosed patients, we can't help them get the clinical care that they deserve. But it also really limits their ability to participate in clinical research. And it's such a pivotal time for our disease community where we have sponsors that are developing drugs, but we need patients, right, that are well characterized, including having a confirmed genetic diagnosis to help to participate in those clinical trials. So the patient-facing program we ran through, and we're really excited about the results from that. We're wrapping up our clinician-facing program in the coming months. And importantly, as you know, Brian, it's about sustainability. So now we're starting to think, what did we learn from these two pilot programs? How do we design the most valuable, no-cost genetic testing program that serves the interests of our patient community?
Phil, there's probably nothing more exciting than taking the pilot title off of those programs. Right? Yes. We're excited to be able to learn that way, and we're grateful for the generosity of supporters who allow us to go out there and build these pilot programs. But you could take that pilot title off and keep that consistent drumbeat in the community. It's so important. And it dovetails nicely into some of our work. We continue to see great growth in the MitoShare patient registry. We talk about it a lot on this podcast because it's so important to advancing therapeutics and helping families on their journey. I know we've crested over 1,500 members in the registry. I know that excites you.
Yes, that's a really nice number to hit, and we're watching this constantly, right, to see how good a job we're doing at making the case for why it's important to join a patient-populated registry. For anybody watching this that may be a mitochondrial disease patient or a caregiver of someone that's a mitochondrial disease patient, joining a patient registry like MitoShare is just another way where you can participate and engage in the overall mission of the foundation. And we recognize that living with the disease or caring for someone with a disease is a burden, right? At some level, it's completely within your control as to how much you participate. So right. No one should feel like, if I join that, then I'm going to have to be on it every day. Not at all. We really try to minimize sort of the initial information that at least allows us to understand your diagnosis and the types of symptoms that you're dealing with. But beyond that, we'll present opportunities, and as your time allows, as your schedule allows, as your life situation allows, participate to the best of your ability. So I'm really excited about the direction it's moving.
Well, it's all part and parcel to the real bread and butter of UMDF, our ability to find and fund great research around the globe for mitochondrial disease, for specific forms of mitochondrial disease. We're proud of 25 plus years of directly funding research, over $15 million funded, over 100 labs. We put out a list the other day of every single lab we have funded since our inception, over 115 labs there. A real hallmark of our organization, driven by our donor community to do that. And then on top of that, our ability to unlock dollars as well too. Unfortunately, I think sometimes a kept secret at UMDF is our work that we do on Capitol Hill to unlock dollars to the tune of over $160 million. When you think about our ability to advocate for mitochondrial disease to be recognized by the Department of Defense and the National Institutes of Health. That's the real halo effect of what our community can do for us.
A perfect description of it, and I think, as you aptly said, for far too long, we kind of kept that almost as like our little secret,
Yeah.
right? The goal of our funding is, of course, to advance the research, but we also know limited capital, limited ability to make large grants. We can't fund everything, but our goal is always to think about, is this a project, and if we seed it financially and it's successful, can it go on and get follow-on funding?
Yes.
And that $160 million number, right, that we've done by looking at all the follow-on grants from everything that we've made, clearly demonstrates exactly that kind of impact. It's leveraging.
But for the UMDF and its community of supporters, we can't pull that off. And I'll just put a little plug in there for our advocacy program and all these programs we've talked about today. Visit umdf.org to learn more about that. Phil, as we're talking about research, one of the places we've seen just a real meteoric rise in activity around funding research has been with our family impact funds. And these are funds that are built and driven by dedicated patient family fundraisers, whether they're doing special events or direct gifts. They create their own funds. And in many cases, UMDF works with these families to develop out some bespoke research programs. We're going to talk about one of those programs today, which I'm really excited about. But just comment a little bit on just some of the growth you've seen on families, being the battering ram for opening up research for the mito community.
I'm really proud of the way our organization has evolved. We've always been an umbrella organization that covers all forms of mitochondrial disease, and knowing that there's hundreds of different types of mitochondrial disease, oftentimes we're just looking to fund the best research, regardless of if only a subset of patients might benefit from it, but we're trying to advance the field in general. But with the patient impact funds, the family impact funds, the opportunity we have is to also go deep on certain topics. Where, like you said, if there are families that have the capacity and the drive to want to push a more targeted approach, right, to research, let's understand your interests, our ability to bring funds together, and then go out and identify the best opportunities to advance that. So it's like the perfect complement to our annual grant cycle that's looking to fund the best science, regardless of what area of mitochondrial research it may cover. And here's our chance to dive deep in partnership with patient families. It really is, I think, one of the most important new directions over the past 5 to 10 years for the foundation is advancing these more impact funds with the families.
Well, our first guest today, certainly no exception to the rule of passion and drive and ability to rally the troops and fundraise. We're so grateful for the good work this family has done for UMDF in advancing research. He's a member of the UMDF Board of Trustees. He's the founder of the Cousins for a Cure event. And I know the title he's most proud of is Dad. So welcome to the Powerhouse podcast, Mr. Alan Breslow. Alan, good to be with you today.
It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Now, Alan, I don't know if you know this, but this is a widely viewed podcast. So there may be people who are tuning in who don't know about you and your story and what we're about to talk about today. So I'm just going to kick things off a little bit just to tell us a little about you, yourself, your family, and the inspiration behind the Cousins for a Cure event.
Thanks, Brian. It's been a journey, a very long journey, 31 years, in fact. Sydney was born in 1992, and soon after we knew something wasn't quite right. She had delayed milestones, and we just were concerned. So we started reaching out to doctors and specialists and taking her to them to be examined to try to determine what was going on. But frankly, we couldn't get any answers. Genetic testing wasn't sophisticated as it is today, so it was more just to a whole host of specialists and getting multiple opinions. Finally, in 2001, we were referred to Dr. Richard Kelly at the Kennedy Krieger Institute at Johns Hopkins University. So we sent our Sydney's records down. Unfortunately, he let us know that he was not taking any additional patients at the time. However, after examining her records, we did get an appointment, and we went down where he examined Sydney very thoroughly, ran some tests, and he determined at the time that he was pretty sure that Sydney had a mitochondrial disorder. 23 years later, Dr. Kelly is still Sydney's mito specialist, and frankly is our mito hero. So we reached out to UMDF to try to learn more about mitochondrial disease and disorder. We got involved in walkathons and raising the coins for cash program or coins for mito program, and anything else we could do on a local level. And Sydney was front and center participating at school and outside of school. And we received notification, Sydney did, that she was being honored with the Heartstrings Award at the 2010 UMDF Symposium. So we went out to Symposium and she received the award, but we also saw front and center what mitochondrial disease is and can be about, and it was very heart-wrenching. In fact, so much so that we didn't return for 7 years to the symposium. In 2013, Sydney did go through genetic testing, as did Sherry and I, and it was determined that Sydney had a genetic defect of the MECR gene. And 3 years later, it was confirmed that it was a mitochondrial disease that is today known as MEPAN. Also in 2013, the day after Thanksgiving, our nephew Logan died suddenly. And that night, that Friday night, we drove back to Raleigh to be with our family. And when we walked in, immediately, Debbie and Ron, Logan's parents, said that they didn't want anything like this to happen to Sydney. And they wanted us, for all of us to do something. And that's when the Logan Sloan Aronson Research Fund, in honor of Sydney and in memory of Logan, was born. Then in 2016, 3 years later, we held our first in-person Cousins for a Cure fundraiser.
A lot of heart behind that. You mentioned your lovely wife, Sherry, who I know is at the helm and planning these great events with great volunteer committees and donors and special folks in your life. And we do appreciate you sharing that background there, Alan. And I know we're going to get to here in a little bit talking about the impact of these programs, the impact of this event. That's probably the most important thing that we all can do together for our donor community, is to talk about when you choose UMDF, when you choose Cousins for a Cure as a charity of choice, it's our responsibility to make sure that we're paying that off for you to demonstrate that impact. I want to take you back a little bit, though. You mentioned Symposium of being unique and eye-opener. And for the uninitiated, walk us through that a little bit of what that experience was like for you. And I'd love for you just to kind of add, coming to Symposium this past year in 2023, just some of the differences you've seen of those past 15 years.
Well, we came 15 years ago, and then there was a several year gap, because it was extremely traumatic. Because it really just slaps you right in the face. You see so many other people, far worse families that have children and young adults that are just struggling. It was really impactful in not the best of ways, but it was a great wake-up call for us. And when we came back, we've now tried to make it to every symposium thereafter. Changes, it's light years. We went from, I guess there was about 250 people there. What's so incredibly important and unique about Symposium is that not only do you meet the families, but doctors that are treating patients and researchers that are studying the disease, trying to find treatments and cures. It's a very unusual mix, but you get to interact and interface with these people and learn so much. Families with families, families with doctors, families with researchers, researchers with researchers. There's this mix that is so incredible. And there's nothing like it, because it really does bring hope and promise and progress. And it really, I think it serves, we've come to feel that it serves as a beacon of light.
Mm.
I guess this last symposium in Charlotte in July, where I mentioned there's a couple hundred people 15 years ago, about 650
Yeah, big event.
participants. And what's so exciting is to see the more seasoned clinicians, researchers, doctors with this whole vibrant array of young, new researchers with new ideas that are coming out of school and joining different hospitals and research programs. And it was very, very exciting for us. This symposium was most exciting for a few different reasons, because Dr. Doug Wallace, the quote unquote father of mitochondrial disease, and Dr. Deborah Murdoch they're all from the Center of Mitochondrial and Epigenomic Medicine at Children's Hospital Philadelphia, which is Cousins for Cures. Phil, you mentioned earlier, directed program. They brought MePAN, Sydney's mitochondrial disease, front and center. It was one of the highlights for us, because while there are very few people that have been diagnosed with this particular form of mitochondrial disease, it was right there for everybody to learn and exchange information and knowledge and research programs that are going on from all corners of the world.
I think you teased a perfect introduction, Alan, to bring in our special guest today, the father of mitochondrial medicine, Dr. Doug Wallace. Good to be with you, Dr. Wallace, and his esteemed colleague, Dr. Deborah Murdoch, with a beautiful stained glass mitochondria behind you. And it's good to be with you both today. We're delighted to have you here to give a little bit of an update on the good work that you've been doing in relation to the Cousins for a Cure event. And I'm going to ask my esteemed colleague, Dr. Phil Yeski, to help guide a conversation today. This is, part of his job with the PhD behind his name, and as Phil knows, my B- in science. I turn these types of conversations over to him. But Phil, we are graced by really smart people today who are doing really good work. We talk about, I have the fun job going and marketing this organization, asking people to give, and I have no shame in doing that. I love asking people for money. What I really love to do is put that money to work and to be able to demonstrate impact. And boy, we're going to have a great conversation today to help kick this off.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm thrilled that Alan is with us as well, together with Drs. Wallace and Murdoch. I'd love for this to be a conversation, that involves everyone here. As Alan described and Brian talked about, this all started from a very personal relationship and the drive of the Breslow family to advance research around MePAN. Doug, maybe you can just kind of briefly set the stage for where MePAN falls in all the myriad of mitochondrial disorders, and then Debbie, maybe we can turn to you to talk a little bit about your research and how it tries to address it. So Doug, can I ask you to do that?
Yeah, well, thank you for inviting us to be a part of this program. We have come to regard the Breslows. I hope they don't mind as part of our family. They're phenomenal people dedicated to the health of children with mitochondrial disease and trying to make a difference, at which they are doing. One of the things that you said a little earlier, Phil, is that UMDF has been investing in basic research in mitochondrial biology and medicine, which then ultimately bears fruit and helps people to understand their disease and we hope ultimately to find a cure. I think it's really useful to get a perspective on that particular point. So our lab started working on trying to define mitochondrial biology and disease in 1971. It took almost 40 years before we had the basic principles to even discuss mitochondrial DNA mutations and how they might result in disease. And then understand the nuclear genes that were involved and how they might be involved in disease. And so I've had the privilege of having some really brilliant people working with me, and one of them was Dr. Murdoch. Almost 25 years ago, we were working on a very different disease, one that causes muscle and heart problems. And we had made a mouse model for this disease. And Dr. Murdoch was, of course, a brilliant scientist at that time, an investigator, decided to look at the biology of this mutation in the nuclear genome and look at how the genes that are expressed might be altered. And she came up with this protein that didn't have anything like a name like MEPAN or MECR, but said, gee, that looks kind of interesting. And so she spent 25 years working on this particular protein and its relationship to what we now know as mitochondrial fatty acid synthesis. And by laying that groundwork for 25 years without any concept that this would immediately be beneficial to Sydney, all of a sudden, about 4 years ago, bang, we had all the background. Debbie had done all the groundwork, and now we were able to do something with it. So really hats off to Debbie for doing the basic hard work over 25 years before people really realized how important her fundamental contributions were.
Yeah, absolutely. And Debbie, we can't thank you enough for all the contributions you've made in the mitochondrial research space. And sometimes it's an alignment of the stars. And, in this case, your research interests with the very strong interests of a family such as the Breslow. So maybe for our audience who may or may not have deep technical expertise, if you could just kind of summarize in general your learnings around the MECR gene, the importance of fatty acid synthesis, right, to mitochondrial function, maybe even bringing it up a level for a second just to talk about mitochondrial function and mitochondria. It might help to set the stage where then we can talk a little bit about your specific research.
Sure. And again, thanks for inviting me. This talk is bringing together some of my favorite things in the world, which is mitochondrial research and UMDF and the Breslow family. I feel really lucky that these things synthesized. But talking about history in UMDF, I was just calculating, and 20 years ago, I gave a talk at UMDF at the meeting and talked about this new pathway that we'd run into, and we had no idea what it would look like if you had defects of that pathway in a human. So, we've learned a lot along the way, and there's a lot we really don't know. But when we found out that there was a family that was dealing with some defects in fatty acid synthesis, we knew we had to look at the brain and the eye, which we really didn't know beforehand. And so we learn a lot from talking to patients, from UMDF. And so I think we put those things together now. And we've even had that MEPAN portion of the UMDF meeting where we put together an international group that had been working on the project for a very long time, that had been working on this pathway. And we had researchers come from Finland and from Israel. And I think it really helped all of us to think about how the pathway works.
Phil, you mentioned the stars aligning. How ironic that we live 30 minutes away from Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And here they were working on something, and we have this issue. The stars truly have aligned for us, and we're the ones that are blessed having found Dr. Wallace and Dr. Murdoch. And the progress, hopefully they'll be able to talk a little bit, Dr. Murdoch, a little bit about the progress made in such a short period of time. I think when I asked Dr. Wallace the last time we visited him at the lab, are you behind at or where, ahead of where you expected to be? He effectively said that they're immeasurably ahead, light years ahead of where the expectations were when this project started. And so we truly are blessed.
Yeah, well, let's try to dive into that a little bit just to understand what the very generous funding of the Breslow family has enabled within your lab, Debbie. I know from the early conversations with the Breslow family and Alan, I can still remember being on, phone calls, conference calls with you and Sherry, and just trying to think about, okay, all right, we think we can raise some money around this. We want to advance research. What opportunities are out there? We know this research is taking place at CHOP. That seems like a great starting point. But quickly, we identified therapeutic development as the real priority. Right? You have a daughter that is in dire need of a therapeutic, like many other mitochondrial disease patients. So I think that really helped to hone in our conversations then with Drs. Murdoch and Wallace about how do we frame this research. So Debbie, I think in the early phase, right, it was really about preparing for therapeutic development, right? The sort of tools and models that you need to have in place to be able to develop those drugs. So maybe you could just briefly describe sort of the phase 1 activities.
Yeah, so what we learned from those, how many patients existed at the time, maybe 15, we learned that the main problems were with movement and with speech and with the eye. And we knew that neurons, those things are all very important in those processes. And so we've been working up to that time with cells in a dish. We feed the cells, they came from somewhere else. Some of them aren't even human. And we learned a lot about the biology, what's that protein doing in those cells. But we realized if we wanted to make a drug and test it in an efficient way, we were going to need better models. And so one thing we did was to make a mouse model of MePAN. And so we put the same mutations that are in patients into a mouse. That doesn't always work. Again, we got really lucky and it worked right away. And the mouse has a movement disorder. It moves differently. It has different balance. And its eye has some demonstration of disease too. And so they have a normal lifespan, so we can keep them in the lab. And then all those things that were in our head, well, we think the pathway does this. Can we make this and give it to, of course, we don't want to give it to Sydney. Now we can give it to a mouse under very controlled conditions. And we can see now, we have a measurable way to measure if the movement problem goes away. And so our first year was really we set about to make the mouse, to characterize the mouse, because we need to have numbers, right? We need to be able to say it's this much better. And then we also took some of Sydney's cells that had been taken in a biopsy many, many years ago. And Johns Hopkins sent them to us out of a freezer. And we grew those cells up. And then, again, we want neurons. So we have a way now that we can take those cells, which are skin cells, take them back to the way they were before they became skin cells, and then re-differentiate them into neurons. So now we have really Sydney's genetics in a neuron in a dish. And so that gives us a very high throughput. We can test a lot of drugs at the same time. So that first year was really spent developing those tools.
Yeah, let's just pause there, because again, I think for our audience, particularly those of you who have donated as part of Cousins for a Cure, your donations made this happen. And I cannot emphasize enough how important these early discoveries within Dr. Murdoch's lab are. To have a animal model that recapitulates, right, what happens in human disease is probably the most important asset you can have if you want to develop therapeutics. To then be able to extend that to be able to develop models that simulate what is happening inside the brain of a MePAN patient. Now we're focusing in on perhaps the most important symptoms, right, associated with Sydney's disease. So it's your generous donations and commitment to the Breslow family, to UMDF's mission that's allowed this to progress in Dr. Murdoch's lab. And that's just the beginning, because now we're getting to the exciting part, right, Debbie, where we have the models, we have neurons, and we have a mouse model. Now we can start to think about, let's screen a lot of different drug types to see what's most effective and perhaps changing how the mitochondria function inside these models.
Right. And we're really taking everything we've learned in those last 25 years of looking at the pathway and what we think the pathway might be doing, because really we know it affects mitochondria. We don't know exactly how that works. And so we're learning a lot about the basic biology too, but we can take those informed guesses and test different drugs. We can do a targeted approach rather than taking everything under the sun.
Yeah.
And that's our plan right now.
Yeah. Well, Doug, maybe this is a good point to just orient everybody because, again, we're working in this space every day. We know, the challenges associated with medical research. Quite often, I think those listening to this podcast or watching, might say, what do they mean it takes a long time? Or we still don't know a lot of things. Maybe put into context, if you can, just the challenge of human biology and how complex it is and why it takes 20 years, right, to get to a point like this. I think you're a perfect person to just put that into context and why we have to keep going, right? We're never there. There's just so much ground to still cover.
Well, exactly. First of all, we are privileged to live in a unique time in biomedical science. When I started in this field in 1968, we had almost no knowledge about human genetics at the level that we're talking about. And we had to, first find out what the mitochondria did, and then the fact that it had its own DNA, and then that there were additional genes that were in the nucleus that interacted with it, and then how they interacted and what their functions were. And then we had to find ways to study them in animals and in culture. So this took from 68 well into the mid 80s just to get the basic framework. There were some nice help in that area because there are other model organisms that are even simpler than the mouse, such as yeast cells, which do have the fatty acid synthesis pathway, and some information was obtained through that, which gives some guidance and input. But you can never absolutely trust a compound that might work in yeast when you put it on a human, because humans have so many other dimensionalities about their different tissues, their different organs, how they might respond to that drug. So then you have to go through the arduous work of making an animal model that's close to humans so you can look for toxicity. The first mouse model our center made, it took 20 years to develop the technology to actually be able to put a mitochondrial DNA mutation into a mouse and then have it recapitulate one of the mitochondrial DNA diseases. So likewise, without Debbie's groundbreaking research on what the fatty acid synthesis pathway was, we wouldn't have been able to, she wouldn't have been able to target the specific gene to make the right kind of mouse and know what to study. So try and get it into perspective. Science requires not only great ideas and hard work and commitment of all the people that want to support the effort, but it also requires technologies, and technologies have to be invented. So in the area of mitochondrial medicine, when I started, there were no technologies. So literally, we've had to invent every new technology to make the next step. And so at this point now, we have a pretty good armamentarium to look at diseases like MIPAN and to begin to now really take an aggressive look at looking at disease therapy, outcome, pathology, et cetera. But this would not have been possible even 15, 20 years ago. We just did not have the tools. So again, the support of donors and UMDF and the symposia and meeting with our colleagues, all of those are critical components to building the workspace in which you can actually address a complex problem. As an example, we first found the first mitochondrial DNA mutation that causes a kind of eye disease called Leber's hereditary optic neuropathy. Started working on this in the mid-1970s because we had shown that mitochondrial DNA was maternally inherited, and it looked like labors might be maternally inherited, although nobody had thought about that at the time. So we've envisioned that we would need to sequence the mitochondrial DNA, which nobody knew how to do. So we had to figure out how to do that. But then we wrote to families all over the world to say, could you send us a blood sample on of one of your family members with Leber's hereditary optic neuropathy? Unfortunately, people were kind enough to do that. I then received a blood sample from a person in Britain, and I got a call the next week and said, so what causes Leber's? With the realization that he thought by giving the blood sample within a week, we would have the answer. And it, in fact, took another 20 years to give him the answer, but in fact, the answer was obtained. So it's the long-term support and the commitment of UMDF and people that fund it, and the families and the researchers. The long goal. This is not short-term gain. This is long-term gain. But in the long-term gain, all the people that suffer from mitochondrial disease will benefit from these milestones. And we can't say how grateful we are to the support of UMDF and the families for that opportunity.
Well, so many important messages in there that I couldn't even possibly summarize them all, but just establishing that there's an urgency to everything that's being done. The patients that are living with mitochondrial disease now do not have the benefit of time on their side, right? So we need therapeutics as quickly as possible. But we also have this fundamental challenge of biomedical research being difficult. And often the intersection of those two things is money. It's having the capital available to advance the research that otherwise may have to wait for a federal grant from the NIH or some other source. So again, Alan, I think we come back to your donors and Cousins for a Cure and their ability to make these things happen in an urgent way. Yes, we have to have the researchers, but without the money, we can't make it happen.
Well, and again, we've been blessed countless times over the years from our family, friends, dear friends, and business associates to be able to be in a position where Cousins for a Cure can underwrite research projects like this. And it's one of the points that I think is important to get across is how important the family funds are. As a matter of fact, Sherry and I kind of discussed this and decided we're here to help other people that want to create family funds. The way what we've done, we're here to help coach and help people avoid some of the challenges and mistakes that we made along the way. And as a matter of fact, interestingly, the importance of family funds didn't go too far away from home. So at our last Cousins for a Cure event in November of 2022, I think there's three things that really excited us about that event. But first and foremost, we exceeded our fundraising goal and surpassed cumulatively more than $1 million raised. And the money, it's a lot of money, but in the research world, it spends pretty quickly. And we're very excited to be able to fund the second phase of research that is already underway. Dr. Murdoch and Dr. Wallace are spearheading. But I think one of the other benefits was having Dr. Murdoch and Dr. Wallace be able to come to our event and share in very simplistic terms, thank goodness, because Brian got a B-, I maybe got a C- in science and physics and all of these things, but be able to explain what the dollars are actually accomplishing. And that is incredible. And then the third thing that it was so important is that we have a lot of family support, and all of these between our brothers and sister-in-laws and parents and cousins, which there were 12 specifically. one of them, our cousins, niece and nephews, Mitzi and Jeff Solomon, her husband, have been very supportive from the very beginning. And after the event, they came to us and said, with a great idea, we'd like to start a Cousins for a Cure Atlanta. And Mitzi has an unspecified mitochondrial disorder herself, and so it's very close to their hearts. And they have, Mitzi and Jeff have a very close relationship with Sydney, had a very close relationship with Logan, and as you do with all the kids. But our first reaction to that was, sure, let's go. And that's become kind of the slogan for Cousins for a Cure Atlanta. They had a kickoff event in May, which Brian and Tanya were kind enough to attend, support, and participate in. And
over 100 of their friends in that room. That's when I knew we were in a good position for this to be successful. You walk in this room and it's packed full of potential supporters.
Yep. And their first event is February 1st, 2024. So we're very excited. They're running with this on their own. We're just here as supporters and mentors as best we can. And we're very, very excited. So I guess Cousins for a Cure is franchising now.
We're going nationwide.
all to benefit. I was going to say all to benefit, not just MePan, but they're going to want to work on the other mitochondrial projects, and all to benefit UMDF.
Well, I think that's a really important takeaway here, Alan, is that any of this research that's getting funded, even if it is directed towards MePan, it's still advancing fundamental learnings, right, about mitochondrial biology that has the opportunity to be of much greater benefit to many more mitochondrial disease patients, but also many other types of more common diseases that have mitochondrial dysfunction as a component of their pathology. And Doug, I know this is something we could talk for hours about, and this is probably not the right context, but in short, it's hard to really overstate the importance, right, of mitochondrial function to the human health condition.
Absolutely. If you think about yourself and all those people you care about, what's important? And what's important is that they're animated, they're alive, they're active. Well, how does that happen? Unfortunately, when a person dies, their immediate structure doesn't change. So why aren't they the same? And the answer turns out, what animates us is our mitochondria. It's the most fundamental aspect of being alive. And therefore, this work that the UMDF is doing, and the Breslows and the Solomons and all the other great people that are investing in mitochondrial medicine, they're actually addressing things like aging and Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and blindness and cardiovascular disease and renal dysfunction. These are all topics our center is actively working on from a mitochondrial perspective. And therefore, the drugs that Debbie's going to develop for MePan, those could well be valuable to other more common diseases. So our larger vision is that, yes, we are working diligently to help Sydney, but our vision is that we are transforming medicine. We're going to take what has been basically an anatomical worldview of disease and realize that it's more important to know about what it makes us to be alive than what it is to give a particular organ. And that viability, that vitality is UMDF and mitochondria. And I'm probably one of the biggest advocates that we need to really change our whole medical perspective from simply thinking about a disease as due to a symptom in an organ, to realize that you can have a systemic problem in your mitochondria with terrible effects on individual organs. And until the world understands that, we aren't going to help Sydney or all the other wonderful people that are suffering from what up till recently was basically an unknown problem. And I will just say one other example. I had a patient in the early 1980s. She had cardiomyopathy. She had a big lump on her back. She was having progressive loss of memory. And the medical community said, well, those symptoms just don't go together. She must be faking it. She must need to see a psychiatrist. I went and saw her and I said, you can't fake a heart problem. And that's when we were dedicated to figuring out why you could have a problem that would affect so many different organs. And that, I think, is the story of most people on the mitochondrial medicine journey. They have these huge clinical files because they've seen so many different specialists and with frustrating results. But UMDF is leading the way to give us a new vision and to, I think, solve many of these complex problems. So,
wow. Thank you for saying that, and we are thrilled to be a part of that. And as usual, you're being quite modest. You're not just one of the leading or biggest advocates. You are the biggest advocate for the importance of mitochondrial function in human health and disease. And we're so fortunate to have you be a part of this community.
Yes.
And maybe just a kind of
say. May I just say that they call me the most extreme mitochondriac?
It's a perfect.
By the way,
Phil,
just so you're aware. So after Mitzi and Jeff came to us and wanted to start a Cousins for a Cure Atlanta, they very soon thereafter came up and visited the lab at CHOP. And to be very candid, the two people that are sitting here talking, Dr. Wallace and Dr. Murdoch, and you can feel the passion, they cinched the deal. And it also motivated Mitzi and Jeff to get some of their dear friends involved. Brian mentioned there were 100 people at their event, but their close friends, Kim and Dr. Mike Gottschalk, are partnering with them in this endeavor. Because they just wanted to get behind something and do good to help people. So it's that passion, though, that Dr. Wallace exudes, which is moving this so quickly. The ball is hopefully rolling down the hill now, not being pushed up the hill.
But just think what our opportunity is. We have the possibility of changing the entire landscape of how we treat common disease. And the magnitude of the effect that UMDF and the donors can have on such a transformative change to help millions and millions of people. Even at 76, I refuse to give up.
Thank you.
I can't think of a better way to demonstrate impact and bring a charge to our community. It makes a podcast host happy when your guest can really wrap up an awesome conversation with a charge like that. And I feel, what's what I'm looking for today, Phil? I feel so responsible today, right? Responsibly part of a team to make these things happen.
Yeah, it's inspiring, right? More than anything else, right? When you feel the energy of those we're partnering with and collaborating to make these things happen. It's what puts the wind in my sails every day to keep pushing on this with that shared mission. And this may have started as two stars aligning, but it's so exciting now to see this becoming a constellation, right? Just stars and stars upon stars, all connecting together. And we are going to advance this research. And Debbie has a lot of exciting things going on. There's even cutting edge research that we could talk about as well. That's even a little bit further out. But as Doug said, it's an incredible time to be alive. We're so fortunate there are tools being developed that are giving talented researchers like this the ability to really go in and address these diseases in substantive ways. So really inspiring, Brian.
Dr. Murdoch, Dr. Wallace, we thank you so much for the good work you're doing and the time you spent with us today to give an update. It's so important to us that as we think about that cycle of building awareness, fundraising, funding worthy projects, it's such an important piece of that is stewarding that conversation, stewarding that process, and you're such an important part of that team. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for everything.
Thank you, and we really enjoy working with you all.
Thanks so much. Well, Phil and Alan, I know something else that we didn't get a chance to talk about today was some of the other ways that the Cousins for a Cure event is supporting the UMDF mission. And we alluded to this a little bit, Alan, earlier about your event's interest in funding the next generation of mitochondrial disease researchers too. And we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about that as well. I wanted to make sure we could highlight our accelerators program. And I know when you came back to Symposium, Alan, one of the moments for you was experiencing our big pitch event where we bring postdoctoral fellows to present well-vetted science in front of our donor community to ultimately win a $50,000 prize. But walk me through a little bit of just your relationship, your experience, Alan, with our accelerators program.
Well, I guess this was your brainchild and really brilliant. The accelerators program is kind of, I think it's feeding new blood into research in this particular field. So, and Brian, please correct me if I trip up here, but UMDF sponsored this program, reaching out to researchers to submit projects, research projects into UMDF, with the prize being a $50,000 fund, to a $50,000 check going to fund some of that research. And this was, I guess, the fourth time around now. It's just four. Yeah, four.
We might be heading on 5. Yeah, this is great.
Yeah, wow. And so the big pitch, after I guess a review committee reviews all of these submissions, it narrows it down to 3, and then the big pitch, the 3 candidates, the 3 finalists get to come and present their research project, of which for many of us it kind of goes way over the head, but you get the passion, you can feel the passion and get some sense of their ideas and what they're doing. So the first time the big pitch, the 3 finalists made their pitch, and what's really unique is that anybody that has made a donation, I believe $500
right.
or greater, get to vote. So you get to participate in the winner and the selection of the winner. So after the first time we experienced this, we were so taken with all 3, we didn't know how to vote. So after the winner was announced, Sherry and I went up to Brian and said, "Hey, we'd like Cousins for a Cure to fund one of the other 2 candidates." And evidently somebody else had the same idea. So all 3 were funded. And we kind of made it a practice at every symposium, if it makes sense, if it sounds like an interesting approach for all mitochondrial disease. This is not for Sydney. This is for everybody. And the work that we're trying to do is not just for our daughter, who's front and center, but for everybody affected by this disease, and to help educate as well. So we felt it was important to continue this path of funding. As a matter of fact, we did fund a young man in July, Jonathan Dietz, who's a PhD at, interestingly, I guess the 3 candidates were from 3 different parts of the world, and Jonathan's right up the road in Rutgers, at Rutgers University. So we're very proud to be able to underwrite his good work as well.
It's fantastic. And Phil, I think about the story that Dr. Murdoch talked about 20 years ago, giving a talk at UMDF Symposium. And as we think about these moments, we love those stories, to know that there was a moment for a researcher. And it's the spirit behind the accelerators program, is to capture these really bright people who are dedicating their careers to mitochondrial science. Please.
Well, I just gotta say, it's just another example of seed planting, right?
Yeah.
Where these aren't just any researchers; these are fresh PhDs, right? Just finishing their doctoral work, their training. Now they're doing what's called a postdoctoral fellowship, which is really about sort of a next level of training period. And this is the chance for us to hook them, right?
Yeah,
To get
right.
them excited about mitochondrial disease, to see the connection, right, to the patient community. So it's all about planting seeds and trying to grow the number of researchers that are working in this space.
One of my favorite jobs as a fundraiser, a CEO, as a marketer of this organization is stealing really great quotes and leveraging them for our own benefit here at UMDF. And I was interviewing one of our docs one time, and he had made the comment. He started his story with "but for the UMDF," and it was ... It's kind of what Dr. Murdoch was talking about here today. And I'm like, oh wow, that's a perfect campaign for an organization like ours. But for the UMDF, and we've been saying a lot lately. But when we say "but for the UMDF," it's but for the researchers, the patient families, the clinicians, but for our donors. We've talked about a lot on this call today. And Alan, I know that's something that you feel so strongly about, that but for this donor community, all these things that we're talking about simply just doesn't happen. I know that's something that you always like to make sure you share with your guests.
Yeah, it's, I continue to say we've been so blessed by the generosity of family, friends, and business associates. And, it's sometimes it seems daunting that the concept of trying to make a difference. And this has been a very rewarding journey. And all we want to do is continue to help support the incredible team that, Brian, you have, Phil, and your great work, and Tanya, Beth, and there's just so many people. But the passion from within the organization, I think this organization UMDF is unique. It is so unique because it's not a bureaucratic foundation. It's not this big charitable organization that it's all about the money, putting more money in to raise more money. It's about raising money for a cause, and for a disease that probably affects way more people than we know of today. We all have mitochondria, and mitochondria health, we talk about it, is perhaps the elusive fountain of youth, because if you have no energy, you lose your mitochondria, you die. And keeping it healthy is a core component. And Dr. Wallace touched on all of the other projects that they're researching in the relationship of mitochondrial disease and disorder. And so whatever it is, the reality is it takes money, lots and lots and lots of money, private money, public money, but it also takes a passion behind it to make sure that we're driving this cause.
I'm glad you said that, Alan, because that was my little sign-off note for you, and my final thank you to you is thank you for bringing the passion, you and your team. And that's what really moves these forward. We talked a lot about the importance of fundraising here, but you got to have the workhorses behind it to make it happen, not just from a special event standpoint, but making the connections to the scientific community and moving projects forward. It takes a lot of people who care to pull these types of things off, and we're grateful for your passion around this initiative as well, too. Well, and of course, we're grateful for Dr. Murdoch and Dr. Wallace for joining us here today. It's always, Phil, we leave every one of these podcasts like, well, it's time to go get to work, right? Like I had my coffee, and I heard so much great stories of impact. And Phil and I typically leave these events just feverishly go thinking about what can we do next? What's next? Because we have passionate people behind us to make it happen. So thank you.
Always leave inspired to do more.
A great way to wrap up today's show. Alan, thanks so much for being with us today.
We're looking forward to
this year's event. And until next time, everybody, go fast.